How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Rensch. This is Chess.com's YouTube channel, and today we have another installment into our chess openings playlist. That's right, we're going to keep on trucking with this chess openings train and try to make sure we complete the idea of having every main line, every tournament opening, quote-unquote, using Dr. Evil quotation fingers, in our playlist so that you can use it as an intro, especially if you're someone who really wants to learn a little bit more about tournament level chess or organized chess, and you're not just an enthusiast looking for a quick fix. You actually want to try to get better. You can use our openings playlist to start to improve your knowledge of the first stage of the game. So let's do this. You see from the title we have the Scandinavian Defense on the docket today. The Scandinavian Defense is an approach for black after the move 1e4, and that is the move d5. The general idea here is that black is going to sacrifice some time and a small amount of space in the center for the opportunity to eventually have open lines for his pieces and potentially put white in a slightly awkward situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of what happens in the middle games here. Even though black loses some time after the move e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight to c3, basically black has broken one of the oldest principles in the book, which is don't bring your queen out too early, right? Don't use the big girl against the kids, and you're going to run into issues most of the time if you do that. In fact, some amateurs have played this move just because they like to bring the queen out early and retreated this queen right now to c6 and not realize that they actually lose the first lady instantly. So that would be a horrible blunder and not really something we would classify as part of the Scandinavian defense, but just highlighting why there are some risks always whenever you bring the queen out early. But the basic point here is that even though black is going to lose some time with the queen, after finding a safe square, white expands in the center, and as we reach a middle game, one of the most important things to understand about this pawn structure is that even though white has gained some time, this development of the knight being in front of the pawn is not actually ideal. What I mean by that is that ideally in this type of structure, which is actually a Karoslav structure, where black has pressure on the d-file, white would actually like to have this knight behind this c-pawn, controlling more squares in the center and potentially having a much bigger space advantage. It's one of the reasons why in other openings white will actually go out of his way to relocate to try to expand and get his knights out behind the pawns to have more space rather than developing in front of the pawn. So what that does to this position is that even though black has lost a little bit of time with the queen, as we head into one of the mainline middle game type of positions here, after bishop to f5, bishop to d2, e6, black does not fear this immediate discovery on the queen because this queen can find a safe square. Captures, pawn captures. The move bishop to b3 is played to guard this pawn here. And after knight d7, queen to e2, black develops, white gets castled, and black can also castle long. One of the major things about this position is that white has not really increased his control over the center that greatly. Black has opportunities to use different squares and actually at some point to lash out with a move like c5 to give his knight and bishop more space in the center, something that you may see black do on the black side of like a classical Caro-Kann. In this particular structure, if white had more time, white would have liked to have had the pawns advanced and the rooks behind these two pawns and really look to do something with his space advantage. But because he developed in such a way with the knight on c3 in front of the c-pawn, he never really got his ideal control over the center. So black's small loss of time in the center is sort of made up for. Definitely we would evaluate this type of position as slightly better for white, and if white knows the right plan to execute here, which I'm going to show you, white is going to maintain kind of a small lasting edge here, but without a really direct approach, and if black has a few moves here, the position is totally solid for black. And again, black can at some point try to challenge the center and have equally active pieces. The right move here for white is this move knight h4, which attacks the bishop on f5. And after bishop to g6, modern approaches to this position saw white trying to be more aggressive with these pawns, even moves like f4. But after the move f5, this bishop seems like a big Frankenstein pawn on g6, but white can't really do anything. Taking it would allow black to fix his pawn structure and actually have a very solid and potentially active kingside. Whereas retreating the knight would actually allow this bishop to perhaps just trade himself off. And black actually has more potential in the center with control over this outpost square. bringing the knight in there is certainly a possibility. So f4 is no longer considered the best way for white to play, but rather this move g3. White's intention is to continue with knight to g2, knight to f4, followed by driving the h-pawn down to really dislodge black's coordination on the king side. This was an idea first played by Ponomariev, a very strong grandmaster at the highest level, and this type of idea, when executed properly, should leave white with a little bit of an edge in the middle game. But to back up, I wanted to show you the other main line for black in the Scandinavian. That is to develop the bishop to g4 instead of f5. And again, in these positions, the pawn structure is similar in that black will try to put pressure on the d file and take advantage of the d pawn. White is looking for opportunities to sort of relocate on the queen side to expand and get space. And after the move h3, bishop h5, and the move g4 is played, whether right away or even after the move knight to bishop d2, knight to d5, knight takes f6. Again, we see the pawn needing to take. Here's one example why. In this type of situation, especially if you take with the queen, you regret it after g4 and bishop g5. The queen finds herself trapped in the middle of the board. So in this case, again, black takes with the pawn, and like in the other line, you should be aware that black is not really big in a big hurt here with the double pawns, because those pawns actually control many critical squares in the center, and they're not easily targetable by white because there is no open file, there isn't an easy access for the pieces coming to the king side. So these double pawns are not your typical double pawns where they're just evaluated as a weakness and that's that. There actually is some strength to having these pawns controlling different points in the center. So after g takes f6, the move g4 can be played, and once again, after bishop b3, knight d7, queen e2, queen c7, you get a very similar position to the types we were just discussing in the bishop f5 line, except that white has already achieved a small space advantage on the king side. But once again, I would say this position is considered to be very solid for black, and black can develop and look for opportunities to lash out in the center at some point against the d4 pawn, which is a typical thing to do in this pawn structure. The other thing that defines this d5 break, or the other opportunity black has to play for, is playing knight f6 instead of playing queen takes d5. And this way, he's not wasting time with the queen, and so he saves a little bit of face in the center there. He's not really losing time with the queen running away from all the pieces. But this variation, which is known as the Pogoyevsky, allows white to actually achieve the sort of quote-unquote ideal pawn structure a little bit easier. White will typically want to play d4, and after knight takes d5, immediately playing c4, knight to c3, and remembering in many cases to play this move h3 to stop the bishop from pinning the knight on f3. We'll head to a very typical type of middle game here, where white has a space advantage, these two pawns ideally placed in terms of restricting black's activity. Black has a couple ways to lash out in the center, but e5 is met with d5, and even though there's a lot more opening theory than what I'm highlighting here, I would say that white is also maintaining a small edge in those variations as well. So the main point to understand for black is that if you're going to play the Scandinavian and lose time with either the knight by the Pogoyevsky variation or the queen, you have to have really good knowledge of the variations that follow. Understand that at some point, even though you've lost time with the queen, you can relocate the queen to exert pressure against the d4 pawn and potentially even change the pawn structure with c5 or e5. So again, to review those variations I went through a little bit quickly, I would say that after knight c3, queen to a5, d4, all these moves being natural ways to gain space, knight f6, bishop c4, c6, knight f3. Again, both bishop f5 and bishop g4 being black's two main options, with similar positions happening, with white needing to put the bishop on d2. Look for the opportunity to play this discovered attack on the queen, which in the future allows white to relocate the pieces and potentially gain space over here. Noted should be for white, developing the knight to f3 before black has committed this move c6, which creates the exit point for the queen, can be semi-risky if black plays bishop to g4 and tries to use this square on c6 for the knight followed by the rook coming to d8 in one way or another. And this way you see all of black's pieces sort of ganging up on the d4 pawn. And this type of strategy should not be played unless you really understand the sharp variations that follow. It's also totally playable for both sides. But in general, when teaching the principles of this line, I recommend to my students to play bishop to c4, postponing the development of this knight for one more move, leaving black in a position where he really wants to play c6. Now on knight f3, bishop g4 is not the end of the world because the c6 pawn has taken away the square from the knight, preventing black from getting that sort of ideal development that puts pressure on the d4 pawn. So again, there are going to be mainline video series over on our main site, Chess.com, by some different experts of the Scandinavian, but you can use this video as a little bit of an intro to the fundamental ideas behind black's approach in the Scandinavian, as well as what white wants to do when transitioning to a middle game. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video today, and we will see you around on Chess.com.